Hello, Guy. Tonight we are going back to a time when something truly strange crept across England, something you still wouldn't want to catch. Imagine this. The air is thick, heavy with summer heat, and the stench of horses' sweat, and too many people packed into too small a space. You wipe your brow thinking it's just the weather, but by nightfall your clothes are drenched, your chest feels like it's caving in, and you might not live to see morning. This was real. It had a name no one would forget: the sweating sickness. It killed people faster than the plague, and far more mysteriously. The year was 1485, and England was about to crown a new king. But first, the kingdom would bleed sweat. So before you get comfortable, please take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you really like what I do here. And tell me what's your location and local time right now. I read everyone. Now turn off the lights, maybe turn on the fan for some soothing noise, and let's embark on tonight's journey together. The first cases didn't seem unusual. Soldiers always got sick, marching across muddy roads, sleeping in tents, sharing stew with whatever lived in it. You were among them, trudging into London in the heat of August 1485 under the banner of Henry Tudor. You were hoping for glory. Instead, you got fever. It started on the march. Men were complaining of the heat, then of shivering. One dropped, then another. By the time you reached the city gates, you were stepping over limp bodies. You assumed they were drunk or dead from battle fatigue. But no, they were sweating, convulsing, dying, fast. Within hours, the tents were quiet. Even the gossip had stopped. You leaned against a barrel, watching as another comrade screamed, clutched his chest, and then fell like a puppet with its strings cut. You didn't understand it. No wounds, no blood, just sweat, fear, and silence. By the time Henry Tudor entered London as the new King Henry VII, Victor of Bosworth, the city was trembling. Not from celebration, but from something else. Something sticky, something invisible. You remember the smell before anything else. It wasn't death, not yet. It was linen, damp wool, stale breath, unwashed flesh. The scent of too many people sweating out their lives all at once. The doctors had no answers. They tried their usual ideas: bloodletting, vomit-inducing herbs, prayers. One barber surgeon told you to sleep upright in a chair. Another told you to flee the city immediately. That sounded smarter. You made it as far as the Thames. Boats were leaving hourly, packed with families of trembling nobles desperate to escape. You didn't have money for a ride, so you stayed, watched, waited. Within days, it wasn't just soldiers. The rich, the beautiful, even the priests, everyone was collapsing. The disease moved like lightning. You'd feel perfectly fine 1 minute, a little hot maybe. Then the chills would start. Sweat would pour. You'd feel like your insides were boiling. And then darkness. Some died in just 6 hours. That's not a typo. Not 6 days. 6 hours. That's not a disease, that's an execution. Historians still debate whether the first major outbreak was truly new, or if it had been lingering around unnoticed, maybe passed off as some bad plague hangover. But the records are chilling. This wasn't the bubonic plague, it had no buboes. It wasn't influenza, though it made your chest seize like a vice. It didn't smell like cholera. It looked like nothing anyone had seen before, and no one knew how it spread, which is always the scariest kind of sickness. By September, you were sleeping in a cellar under someone's abandoned wine shop. The air was cool, which helped. Every night you wrapped yourself in blankets, and whispered the names of the dead like a prayer. Some people said garlic helped, others chewed dried rosemary. You just held your breath a lot. Odd fact for you during this first outbreak, it seemed to kill mainly the English. Foreigners, French merchants, German scholars, even Italian priests barely got sick, which led to one very weird theory that it was a patriotic disease. A true son of Albion, that sweat. The deaths eventually slowed, cold weather came. London coughed, buried its dead, and got back to arguing about taxes. But something inside you didn't trust it. This wasn't over. It had come fast, it had quelled fast, and it had vanished just as fast. That's not how normal sickness behaves. That's how curses behave. Still, the king survived, which conveniently meant the new Tudor dynasty looked blessed by heaven. You weren't so sure. You'd seen too many angels sweat to believe that, so you stayed quiet, ate what you could, slept with a knife under your cot, and every night you listened for coughing in the street above, because you knew what others didn't. It would come back. You've heard the phrase, the rich get richer, but during the summer of 1485, it was more like the rich get soaked first and die horribly. London was buzzing with something new fear among the noble class. The strange sweating death wasn't stalking peasants in back alleys. It was climbing up marble staircases, creeping under velvet curtains, and laying waste to the folks who could actually afford doctors. You didn't need a physician to tell you who was next. You just had to look at who was sweating the most. The disease moved fast, yes, but also up, socially. Usually epidemics hit the poor first. Rats love a crowded slum. Dirty water, that's poor people's territory. But this thing, it had a taste for wealth. Fancy shoes, silk shirts, Lord So-and-so with a powdered wig and a deer roast on his table. You watched them go down one by one. The court of Henry VII, barely crowned, was already full of empty chairs. Noblemen began locking their gates, stuffing cloth under doorways. They sent servants to fetch supplies, then bolted the doors behind them. But sweat doesn't knock. At first you thought maybe it was some new punishment, divine judgment. Maybe God was tired of politics. But then a bishop collapsed mid-prayer, soaking through his robes, eyes glassy like a fish. Okay, you thought, that's either irony or God is playing favorites. By late September, London's streets were empty. And not the good kind of empty, the eerie, echoey kind. Carriages abandoned, bakers' stalls still dusted with flour. It felt like the city had exhaled and then decided not to breathe again. One morning you saw something you'll never forget, a silk-draped noblewoman, barefoot, running down Fleet Street, with her jewels still on. Her maid was chasing her with a bottle of vinegar and screaming about sweat demons. The noblewoman collapsed before they reached the cathedral. The maid walked away calm as a nun at sunrise. Historians still debate whether it was the close quarters of noble life banquets, balls, and bathhouses that made the upper class so vulnerable. Others think it was simply exposure. Nobles traveled more, talked to more people, kissed more hands. Or maybe the disease just hated tax collectors. Even the king took precautions. Henry VII, who just snatched the throne from Richard III at Bosworth, realized very quickly that wearing a crown did not protect your internal organs from melting, so he locked himself away. Legend says he changed his bedding daily, had fires lit in every chamber, didn't let anyone near him who had so much as a warm sneeze. You saw a servant once running from the royal kitchens in tears. She'd coughed, Just once. That was all it took to get banished from court and likely from this earth. The irony. Most of the poor didn't even know what was happening. No newspapers, no town criers talking about symptoms, just rumors, whispered panic, and the smell. If you were rich and educated, you had access to doctors and books that didn't help. If you were poor, you had superstition, and weirdly, that seemed just as useful. The rich relied on leeches. The poor chewed sage and stayed inside. Guess who lived longer? Odd fact, it's believed that some of the city's rats, normally to blame in any good historical plague, were actually doing better than the humans this time. That's right. Rats won. Aristocrats. You were working as a courier, then slipping notes between frightened merchants too scared to leave their homes. You made good coin because no one else wanted the job. They'd write messages like, "Did you die and is the Bishop of Ely still sweating real poetry?" The stink of lavender oil clung to every letter. You learned quickly if a note smelled too sweet, it probably came from a house full of corpses. One day, a nobleman paid you to carry a package across the city. He gave you gloves, a mask, soaked in something sharp-smelling, and a coin with a hole in it. For protection, he said. He died the next day. You kept the coin. They were dropping fast, and people began to notice the pattern. No matter how wealthy you were, if the sweat caught you, it didn't care about your family crest. Some said it started in the court of Richard III and followed Henry Tudor like a curse. Others thought it came with the French wine. One particularly nervous apothecary blamed goose feathers. The truth no one knew. No one ever knew. You remember watching a noble funeral from the shadows. No choir, no procession, just a quick burial, at night lanterns flickering. The grave was shallow, no one wanted to touch the body. You wondered if the rich were finally learning what the poor already knew: death is quick, messy, and rarely dignified. It's easy to laugh now, centuries later, but imagine being a lord with a castle gold and a room full of scientists and still dying faster than your stable boy. It's like owning the best sword in the world and dying of a paper cut. You heard that at one point, half the Privy Council was gone. The king's inner circle, the people who made the country run, they were either sick dead or hiding in the countryside, which meant for a while, England was technically being governed by terrified butlers. You had a friend who worked in the kitchens at Hampton Court. She said food deliveries were left outside the gates, then dragged in with sticks. No one spoke above a whisper. No one made eye contact. They called it the quietest month in the history of royal gossip, and yet people still tried to live their lives. Marriages happened. Babies were born. Someone even tried to open a new tavern in Cheapside. They named it the Damp Duke. Bold move. Eventually, as the autumn deepened and the frost crept in, the sweat started to retreat. Not completely, just enough for people to open their shutters a crack. The king appeared in public again. Merchants swept their doorsteps, and life somehow limped forward. But you knew what was coming. That wasn't the end. That was just round one. You wake up drenched, not the it's humid kind of drenched, more like someone dumped a bucket of water over your chest while you slept. Your hair sticks to your forehead, your hands are shaking, and your heart, it's pounding like it's trying to break out of your ribs and go find someone else to live in. You don't know it yet, but you've just joined the list. The very short list. The kind of list where most people don't survive long enough to realize they were on it. This is sweating sickness. It's not subtle. You feel fine, until you very much do not. There's no slow incline, no polite fever letting you ease into a sickbed. No, it slams into your body like a horse cart at full speed. Headache, dizziness, a rising panic in your chest that feels less emotional and more biological. The medical writers of the time, those poor, confused souls, described the first phase as anxious. That's putting it mildly. You're not worried. You're convinced you're about to die, and you probably are. Modern historians still debate what exactly sweating sickness was. Was it a hantavirus? An early hemorrhagic fever? Some mutated flu we never saw again? Some scholars lean toward anthrax. Others think maybe it was ergot poisoning. Yes, that's the stuff from moldy rye that makes people hallucinate and die. Here's a fun tidbit. The symptoms of sweating sickness were so specific that it has no real analog in modern disease. It began with chills so intense people would shake out of their chairs. Then came the heat, a suffocating internal furnace. Then the sweat, a waterfall. Not normal sweat, sick sweat, sour-smelling, clinging, soaked through your boots sweat. And then came the hard stuff. You're lying there now, struggling to breathe. You clutch your chest like something's coiled up inside it, squeezing. Your pulse feels erratic, skipping, crashing. Some people screamed for hours. Others just fell asleep and didn't wake up. The final stage, collapse. You could be up walking mid-conversation, then gone, like a puppet snipped from its strings. No lingering decline, just silence. There was no rash, no buboes like the plague, no pustules, just overwhelming dread buckets of sweat and a fast, brutal ending. Some victims were dead within 3 hours of the first symptom. Odd fact, victims were reportedly drenched so thoroughly that it seemed supernatural. Their beds were soaked, their shoes filled with fluid. And the strangest part, the sweat didn't smell like body odor. It had a weird chemical tang. Some said it smelled like wet hay. Others said it was like rotting apples. You're trying everything now, sitting up, standing, breathing through your mouth. A neighbor bangs on the wall. They heard your cough. That's how it starts. That single wet cough. You're not hiding it well. Back then, people thought the sweat was caused by bad air or excessive internal humors. That's old school for your body is out of whack. Treatments included drinking vinegar, applying crushed emeralds to the forehead, not a joke, or being wrapped in layers and placed by the fire to sweat it out. Which sort of seems redundant. You tried the vinegar, didn't help, mostly burned your nose. By the second hour, your clothes are clinging to your skin like wet seaweed. You can't lie still. Everything aches. You get cold, then boiling hot again. Your mouth tastes like coins. You wonder if this is what drowning feels like only on land. Historians still debate how it spread. Airborne touch water, nobody ever found a clear vector. It seemed to strike quickly at random and then disappear. No trail, just chaos. At one point, people believed fear itself could trigger it. That if you were too frightened of the sweat would find you. Charming. That's the medieval version of don't manifest it. And yet somehow some people survived. They'd stagger through the fever, make it through the sweats, and then, miracle of miracles, wake up feeling normal, like nothing had happened. No lingering symptoms, no long-term effects, just a horrible memory and a very damp mattress. But for most, it didn't go that way. Doctors began noticing that the faster the sweat came on, the more likely it was to kill. A slow onset gave you a fighting chance. A crash. Well, you might as well start digging. You lie down again, too dizzy to stand. Somewhere outside, a bell rings. That means another body's being wheeled through the street. They used carts. No ceremony. No prayers. Just load them up, stack them quick. You think of your sister, the one who ran off to the countryside. Smart girl. You think of your mother's old superstition, hang garlic in the corners, never sleep, facing west. It sounds ridiculous now, or maybe it's all you have. You fall into a strange half sleep. You dream that you're standing in a hallway full of steam. Everyone's dripping. No one speaks. Just shuffling, wheezing bodies and a strange chant you can't quite make out. You wake up gasping. Someone's knocking on the door now. Hard, then louder. You hear them call your name. You're not sure if you're alive or not. Then miracle, you sit up. It hurts, but not as much. You're still soaked, but your chest isn't crushing anymore. You cough once, twice. Nothing comes up. You breathe in deeply. Still here. 3 hours later, you're still breathing. You sip a little water. Your hands tremble, but your heart's steady. You survived. You survived the sweat. The odds were not in your favor. The 1485 outbreak may have killed thousands, but records were scarce. Most bodies weren't even tallied. They were just forgotten, like a weird collective fever dream. But you remember. You'll always remember the way the sweat clung to your bones, how it felt like your body betrayed you, and how somehow you clawed your way back to daylight. You'll never trust your own temperature again. You'd think the Emperor would be above all this. You imagined golden walls, crystal goblets, maybe a wall of perfume to keep out the plague stink. And yet even behind the marble of the great palace, Justinian can't keep it out. You hear the rumors whispered everywhere, under cloaks over empty loaves muttered through linen masks. The emperor is sick. You don't believe it at first. Or maybe you don't want to. He was supposed to be untouchable, chosen by God, crowned with incense and fire. If he can't stay clean, what hope do you have? Still, curiosity gnaws at you, so you make your way uphill toward the chalky gate, just to feel closer to the center of things. The square is quieter than usual. The guards are still posted, but their armor looks unpolished. One of them leans heavily on his spear, another coughs. Through the wrought iron gates, you spot something you never expected to see. Empress Theodora in a window staring out at the empty square. She isn't veiled, and she isn't pretending to smile. Her face looks drawn, more stone than woman, and her fingers tap the windowsill like she's counting days. People still talk about Theodora like she's half magic. A former actress, a master of charm, someone who once gave a speech so powerful it stopped a riot. You never saw that speech, but you believe it. You also believe she hasn't slept in days. Inside the palace, panic is soft, well-dressed, and silent. Eunuchs shuffle in pairs. Scrolls go unread. No one raises their voice. Everyone has that haunted look, the one you saw in the bakery mirror before the fever broke. You learn that Justinian has taken to his bed. Some say he has the fever. Others say it's just precaution. Either way, the empire isn't running like it used to. You overhear a scribe muttering, "The silk shipments are late again," like it's the end of the world. Maybe it is. If not silk, then what? Historians still debate how bad Justinian's condition truly was. Some say he came within hours of death. Others claim he simply faked an illness to avoid pressure from the Senate. Either way, things changed. For a while, no decrees were issued. No new laws, no proclamations in the square. You meanwhile go days without speaking to anyone. Your bubo finally shrinks to a hard knot under the skin like a cursed almond tucked into your ribs. You try not to touch it. It pulses sometimes like it remembers. You've started working again, not baking, just helping to dig. Everyone who can lift a shovel now does. You follow the carts, unload the bodies, scrape away the flies. The pay is small, but no one argues anymore. One day, a nobleman's corpse is rolled off the cart. He's wearing rings. You take one, pocket it, then feel shame heat your face. But no one stops you. Another man took his shoes. Another cut the lining from his robe. You stare at the ring all night, then bury it behind the bakery. It doesn't feel like yours. And still Justinian lingers. Theodora, they say, has taken charge. She addresses the Senate in his name. She orders more lime for the plague pits. She commissions icons to be painted of Saint Michael defeating a serpent. You see one such icon, still wet, hanging from a wall near the chapel. The archangel's eyes are huge, filled with pity, or rage, or both. You stand before it for a long time. Another rumor says Theodora won't let Justinian's physicians leave his room. They eat there, sleep there, pray there. One man tried to leave and was found a day later with his tongue cut out. You don't believe that one, but you want to. One night, a procession moves through the street outside your window. No music, just torches. The flames reflect off gold-threaded robes and bald heads. Monks, priests, bishops, carrying a reliquary. Something ancient rumored to hold a bone fragment of St. John. The procession moves slow humming as it goes. You fall asleep to the sound, and for once, dreamless. The next morning, the bells ring again brighter. Crisper. People are whispering, he's recovered. Justinian is alive. You step outside into the pale sunlight, unsure how to feel. He lived. Good. But also, what now? The city doesn't erupt in joy. It just exhales. Slowly. The fires still burn. The carts still roll. But there's something different in the air, like maybe hope, or at least resignation. A group of scribes begins nailing new proclamations to the walls. Tax updates, trade agreements, a call for workers to rebuild the aqueducts. Business as usual, apparently. The empire grinds back to life, creaky and irritable. You find a bench and sit. You rub your palm along the wood, feeling the splinters. You think about the baker, the sailor, the woman with the child. You wonder if Justinian thought about them too, or if power means you get to skip that part. You look up at the palace again. Theodora isn't in the window anymore. The pigeons are starting to come back. You pack your bag in silence. There's not much left to bring an old wool blanket, a bottle of vinegar, a few sprigs of rosemary. You wrap your shoes in cloth to keep them quiet on the cobblestones. Your breath fogs in the early morning air as you slip out the side door and shut it gently behind you. You're running from air. By 1486, England knew the sweat wasn't just a one-time horror. It might go quiet for a while, like a beast sleeping under the floorboards. But when it stirred, everyone could feel it. And once that feeling settled in your chest, you didn't ask questions. You moved. You weren't the only one. By the hundreds, people abandoned their homes at the first hint of illness. One cough in the neighborhood, gone. Someone saw a man faint in the market. Half the street cleared out. Entire towns emptied overnight. It didn't matter where people went, only that they went. You remember it vividly, a city dissolving, tavern shutters nailed shut, bread ovens cold, priests writing last rites before there was even a body, a whisper spreading like wildfire. It's back, and then the bells started again. Funeral bells long, slow, and echoing across fields. You'd hoped the sweating sickness had disappeared after the first wave like a bad dream. But diseases don't dream. They wait. Odd fact, in some towns, local authorities actually banned the ringing of church bells entirely. It caused too much panic, too much running. People thought the sound itself might summon the sweat. Others rang bells constantly, like it might scare the disease away. You ended up in a village on the edge of Norfolk. Tiny place. Cows smoke 2 pubs, 1 chapel. No sweat yet. The locals didn't ask your name, just gave you a cot in the stables and a bowl of onion broth. It tasted awful, but you smiled anyway. For the first few nights, you slept. Truly slept. Not the shallow, twitchy kind of sleep you'd gotten used to in London, where you woke with every creak, convinced it was your lungs giving out, but real sleep. You started to hope. Then someone in the next village fell ill. They say it started with the baker. He felt hot, lay down after the morning kneading, and never got up again. Within hours, 2 of his sons were sweating through their straw mattresses. Then the neighbor's daughter. Then the neighbor. The news traveled on horseback, literally. A rider galloped through town screaming, "Shut your doors, lock your windows. It's here." By sundown, the road out of town was packed. You watched families dragging carts of bedding food and children behind them. People left their animals tied up. Some burned their own linens in the middle of the square. Historians still debate whether these fire-purging rituals helped. Probably not, but it made people feel like they were doing something. Control is comforting, even if it's all smoke. One old man stood in the middle of the crossroads, holding a rooster by the feet. He waved it over his head and shouted something about drawing out the heat. No one stopped him. Honestly, it looked kind of official. You left at dawn. The roads were full of travelers, all moving in different directions, but for the same reason, escape. You passed a woman riding side saddle in a full veil, a group of monks chanting as they marched, even 2 musicians dragging their lutes behind them like broken wings. Everyone looked over their shoulder. The strange thing was none of them were sick. Not yet. That's what made the sweating sickness so terrifying. You didn't have to see it to believe in it. You just had to feel the possibility. And the rules didn't seem to apply. With plague, you had rats. With cholera water. With this. It seemed to come on the wind. Some said it followed riverbanks. Others swore it clung to fog. A few believed it could pass through stone. And then there were the truly poetic folks, those who said the sweat came not from the ground, but from inside the people it killed. They believed fear was the spark. You started wearing layers even in the heat. Thick collars, scarves, gloves. You stuffed herbs into your sleeves. You avoided churches, inns, schools, anywhere breath might hang too long in the air. In one town, the mayor declared that no one could speak within 10 feet of each other. They marked the distance with painted sticks. At market, people used long spoons to pass coins and bread without touching. It almost became normal, and yet inevitably someone always slipped. A careless handshake, a shared cup, a quiet cough at the edge of the room. Then the bells would start again. You stayed one night in a chapel. The priest there had made his congregation wear veils. He gave his sermons from behind a curtain and baptized babies by pouring water from a height with a ladle. You asked him once, Do you think this helps? He shrugged. Probably not, but God listens more closely when we're terrified. There was no vaccine, no understanding, no pattern. The sweat wasn't picky. It took men, women, children. It took the pious and the sinful. It took the careful. It took the fast. It did not take the loud, though, because no one dared speak above a whisper when it was near. Oddly, some towns survived untouched. No one knows why. Maybe luck. Maybe their air really was better. Maybe their water was cleaner. Maybe they just got skipped. One historian suggested that elevation played a role. Another has said soil minerals. One town credited its survival to a nightly ritual banging pots and pans at sunset. They believed the noise frightened the sickness. In reality, it probably just made them feel less alone. You walked for days. Your boots wore thin. Your breath stayed steady. Each morning, you woke up alive. You gave thanks to the sky, the trees, the dumb luck of it all. Eventually, the air felt lighter again. Towns reopened. Markets returned. The sweat for the time being had disappeared, but every time someone coughed, the road filled again. You knew it was coming back the moment summer turned strange. It was the year 1492. Yes, the year Columbus got famously lost on the way to Asia, but while ships sailed westward, England watched something darker roll in from the east, another round of the sweat. You were older now, wiser maybe, definitely more paranoid. You'd spent years watching the weather, for warning signs, scanning faces, for the shine of fevered skin. And one humid afternoon in July, you caught the scent in the air, again wool vinegar, and something metallic, like fear before a storm. The second wave didn't announce itself with explosions. It trickled. A merchant's boy in Kent, a midwife in Essex. Then suddenly, 4 servants at a bishop's estate, all gone in the same night, their sheets soaked, their lips blue. This time, you didn't run. You hunkered down in a little stone cottage outside Canterbury. You'd collected every herb charm and ridiculous anti-sweat talisman you'd ever heard of. Dried sage over the door, crushed wormwood under the floorboards. Even a frog in a jar, as prescribed by one unhinged apothecary. You weren't taking chances, and yet nothing about this wave felt familiar. It was worse. The 1492 sweat moved faster, killed faster, and made less sense. Towns that had been spared last time were hit hardest. Wealth didn't help. Prayer didn't help. The sickness now seemed like it was making a point. You can't predict me. Odd fact, in some places, people reportedly tried to treat the illness by placing their clothes in ovens, baking their garments to kill the bad humors. One man roasted his boots, then wore them hot out of the fire. He walked 20 steps and collapsed. You heard about one village in Yorkshire where the entire population, 47 people, died within a week. They had to bury them in a mass grave and burn the homes, and in London, chaos. Again, it was like the city had forgotten nothing and learned even less. People fled in droves, but this time they left earlier. Nobles vanished before the bells rang. Whole households packed up and vanished overnight. You saw one caravan heading toward Wales with cages of chickens tied to the roof and children wearing rosemary necklaces like armor. Henry VII was still king and still terrified. This time, he ordered plague regulations to be expanded, even though this wasn't technically the plague. Officials passed ordinances banning public gatherings, shutting down fairs, and instructing people to keep their shutters closed. Of course, no one really enforced these laws. Who wants to go door to door during a pandemic? This outbreak wasn't just faster, it was meaner. Victims seemed to offer more. Hallucinations were common visions of fire, of drowning, of being buried alive. You heard one story of a man who begged to be locked in a chest because he believed his body would explode and harm his family. Another screamed that the sweat wasn't killing him, it was boiling the lies out, whatever that means. Historians still debate what triggered this more aggressive wave. Had the pathogen mutated? Had environmental conditions changed? Was it a new illness entirely, just mimicking the sweat? Some suggested it was divine punishment for England's arrogance. Others blamed the new trade routes, the sudden influx of foreign goods of spices, silks, and unseen microbes. One rumor insisted the sweat had returned because someone had disturbed an ancient grave, a knight's tomb. You never found out who, but it wouldn't have surprised you. You helped a physician briefly, well called a physician, though he mostly prescribed wine and naps. He was terrified but committed. He would only examine patients through a hole in the wall, speaking instructions, through a tube like a monk in quarantine. He told you the faster they sweat, the faster they die. You already knew that. It was the slow burn cases you watched closely, those who hovered on the edge for days, lost in fevers, muttering nonsense. One woman near your cottage survived 10 days of sweats. 10. That was unheard of. You visited her after curious. She looked like a ghost. Skin gray eyes hollow, but alive. She whispered, "It spoke to me. The sweat. It wanted my name." You left that house quickly. Oddly, the summer heat seemed to stoke the outbreak. Towns in cooler areas saw fewer deaths. Places with dense tree cover, higher elevation, or frequent fog fared better. That led some to believe the sweat was sensitive to climate heat, activated like a curse, waiting for the right spell. You spent your days boiling water and your nights whispering old rhymes your grandmother taught you. You carried iron keys in your pockets and tied a red string around your left ankle rituals that made no sense but helped you sleep. And just as the death toll reached its peak, it vanished again. That's how it always went. The sweating sickness never slowly faded. It just stopped, like someone blew out a candle. By autumn, the roads reopened. Travelers returned. Children played in the streets again. You heard laughter in town square, shaky, yes, but real. But people had changed. You noticed it in how they spoke quieter with pauses, how they touched less or not at all, how every slight headache made their hands tremble. The sweat left more than corpses, it left ghosts. Not real ones, probably, but the kind that live in muscle memory. You visited London in October. It smelled of smoke and wet cobblestones. The city was breathing again. The king had emerged paler than before, wearing gloves and a half smile. The court had lost dozens. So had the markets. So had you. You carried their names like coins in your coat pocket, too heavy to forget, too familiar to throw away. As you walked past St. Paul's, you saw someone hanging a fresh sign, "Healers and Pest Doctors, inquire within." Below it, someone had scrawled in charcoal, "If the sweat lets you." You didn't go in. You kept walking, because even if the sweat was gone again, you knew it would be back. And next time, it wouldn't knock. It would kick the door in. Oxford used to be noisy. Before the second wave, it buzzed with students in long robes, debating philosophy too loudly, ink-stained tutors mumbling Latin, and the occasional noble's son trying to impress someone with questionable poetry and very certain arrogance. You remember the chatter, the bells, the slam of heavy library doors. Then one morning in 1493, it went silent. You'd taken a position at one of the smaller colleges, scrubbing floors, preparing firewood, occasionally copying texts if the scholars were too hungover. It wasn't glamorous, but it was safe, or so you thought. Education, you figured, was the last place death would linger. Then the headmaster didn't show up for morning prayers. Then the kitchen boy fainted while stirring porridge. Then the bells started ringing too many too fast. Sweating sickness had returned, and this time it came for the thinkers. Odd fact in university towns like Oxford and later Cambridge, the disease often hit with terrifying intensity, as if it was punishing curiosity itself. Some said it was God's way of silencing doubt. Others said it was the dormitory's long wooden corridors, shared basins, shared beds. A perfect playground for a sickness that moved like rumor. You tried to leave, but the gates were already shut. A university official declared a quarantine, a word that had only just started creeping into English usage. You didn't know what it meant exactly. It turned out to mean stay in here and hope. You remember the day the college went quiet. Entire lecture halls were abandoned. Scrolls lay open on desks where students had simply never returned. Someone had dropped a wine cup that rolled down 4 steps and came to rest by the altar unclaimed. One tutor, an expert in Galenic medicine, locked himself in the tower and shouted advice through a tube made from a rolled-up sermon. Keep the head cool and the feet warm, he cried just before he stopped shouting altogether. You spent your days hauling buckets of water and your nights sitting in the old library listening to the sound of sweat-soaked bodies tossing in their cots. You tried to read to calm your nerves, but every book felt too heavy, every sentence like a riddle for the dying. There was one student, Thomas, you think. Red hair, ink always on his hands. He swore he'd found a passage in an ancient herbal about body fire that matched the symptoms. Fever sweats, delirium, sudden death. It's a Roman thing, he whispered, eyes wide. They had it in Gaul. 2 days later, you carried his body to the courtyard. He was still damp. Historians still debate whether the outbreaks in Oxford and other schools were worse because of density ignorance or just plain luck. Some claim the disease lingered in parchment absorbed into the pages. Others blame the latrines. You blame the windows that never seemed to open wide enough. You got sick yourself. Not deathly, just enough to make you question everything. A shiver here, a tight chest there. You wrapped yourself in 3 layers of wool and recited prayers you didn't believe. It passed. Or maybe you were just terrified enough to fight it off. That's the thing. No one ever tells you fear makes your blood move differently. You breathe different. You think different. You cling harder to life. Sometimes that's enough. The college emptied by midsummer. Those who could flee did. Those who couldn't died or waited. You stayed mostly because you had nowhere else to go. And then one strange day in July, the rains came. It wasn't remarkable at first, just a steady downpour, but something about it felt cleansing. The air changed. The smell of death lifted. Students emerged from dormitories like animals from burrows. A few even laughed. The sweat stopped. By August, the gates reopened. Clergy arrived to bless the grounds. Burial crews came with carts, digging more graves than names could be assigned. The university survived, but not whole. Records say that more than 1/3 of some colleges' members vanished in just a few weeks. And still, the doors reopened for the next term. Oxford couldn't stop. Learning couldn't stop. The country needed minds now more than ever, even if they were sweat-drenched and shaking. Odd detail: one professor returning to his office after 2 months found a perfectly preserved apple still sitting on his desk. He took it as a sign of what he never said. He just kept it there for years until it shriveled into something unrecognizable. You stayed another season, helped rebuild, helped clean the rooms, burned a few mattresses, boiled linens, reshelved books. You found a letter under one desk unfinished, just the words, "If I do not return," and nothing else. You didn't throw it away. You folded it, tucked it into your satchel, and carried it with you for years. It reminded you that even the brightest minds aren't immune to mystery or terror. Eventually, Oxford filled with students again. Debate returned. So did poetry, bad music, questionable haircuts, and someone always shouting about Aristotle near the East Gate. But it never felt quite the same. There was a haunted edge to every laugh, a pause between every verse, as if the sweat had left a film on the soul of the school. And maybe it had. You left in the spring, older than you looked and quieter than you'd ever been. Because when you hear too much sweating, too much coughing, and too many final prayers, you start dreaming in silence. Let's say you're dying again. You've woken up soaked. Your chest feels like it's filled with bricks, and your hands are trembling like a leaf in a thunderstorm. But instead of a doctor, someone shoves a dead pigeon under your pillow, ties a coin to your wrist, and sets a candle shaped like your head on fire. Welcome to the Tudor Cure Market. You'd think after 2 massive waves of sweating sickness, England would have learned something, anything, about how to treat it. Nope. Instead, it invented new and creative ways to panic. You found yourself back in London that year. The city was jittery, twitching at every cough. The first stalls to reopen weren't bread sellers or smiths. They were healers, or at least people who called themselves healers. You passed a woman with dried frogs stitched to her hat, claiming she could cure the sweat with her 7 sizzling stones. Nearby, a barrel-chested man sold blessed vinegar from a tin bucket. You watched him refill it from a rain barrel. Odd fact, one of the most popular cures involved plucking the feathers from a live rooster and strapping it to the sweating person's chest. Supposedly, the bird would draw out the illness. Sometimes the rooster died before the patient did. No one asked too many questions about that. You worked for a few weeks, helping a physician. He was one of the more rational types, believed in balance of humors, bleeding, and herbal steam. He wore a velvet cap and carried a small silver bell to alert people he was approaching. He once told you if it's not a miasma, it's a divine rebuke. Either way, sage and onions. You still don't know if he was joking. People paid anything. Gold coins for a promise, pearls for a powder. One noblewoman you met was carrying crushed emeralds in a sachet under her bodice. Her family had read that jewels had cooling virtues. She still died. The jewels went back to the pawn shop. The most ridiculous treatment you witnessed: a man wrapped head to toe in goose fat, lying in front of a fire. The idea was to sweat the sweat out, which frankly makes the same kind of sense as drinking seawater to cure dehydration. You tried not to laugh, but the squishing noise his boots made when he walked was unforgettable. Some cures were borderline logical: mint tea, cool cloths, ventilated rooms, but logic didn't sell as well as drama. People wanted big gestures: candles, bells, relics. One woman sold water she claimed had been poured over a bishop's bones. It was just river water with a pinch of salt. Still someone bought it. 2 shillings. Historians still debate whether any of the treatments had any medical merit. Some of the herbal remedies may have had mild anti inflammatory effects. Lavender, sage, even vinegar could slightly disinfect surfaces. But in truth, most of it was theater. Desperate, expensive theater. You remember one old man who swore he had the answer. He carried around a book bound in green leather, said it was full of ancient Italian cures. He muttered in bad Latin and sold white powder in envelopes marked with little stars. It was chalk. People still bought it. And then there were the sweat lodges. That's what they called them. Little huts filled with hot stones and steam designed to make you sweat out the sickness. You'd sit there wrapped in linens baking like bread. Some people claimed it worked. Others passed out before they made it back to their beds. You tried one once, for science. It was dark, hot, smelled like thyme and fear. You remember the herbalist murmuring something about fire spirits. You remember sweating so much you felt hollow. You also remember nearly fainting. Did it work? No clue. But you survived. One cure you did believe in, strangely enough, was fresh air. You spent most nights outside, wrapped in blankets, breathing slow. Maybe it helped. Maybe you were lucky. You met a widow once, sharp eyes, sharper tongue, who sold charms made from pig's teeth. She didn't believe in them, but she said the act of buying gave people something to hold on to. Sometimes she told you the cure is having something stupid in your pocket. And honestly, she had a point. Even the church got in on the act. Special masses were held for the sweat afflicted. Holy water was blessed by the gallon. Pilgrims crawled to shrines to pray for deliverance. Some made it, some didn't. You walked past a chapel one night and heard a monk whispering over a bundle. Later, you realized it was a sick child wrapped in wet linens, incense burning above him. The child survived, the monk didn't. You started your own little ritual. Before bed, you'd place your shoes, neatly line up your herbs, and whisper the names of those you'd seen cured, even if you didn't believe it did anything. It helped you sleep, and sleep mattered. People said those who slept too deeply during the sweat never woke up. So you trained yourself to nap lightly. You listened to the wind, the breath of the city. You learned to read your body like scripture, because in a time where no cure made sense, your only defense was listening closely to what your bones were telling you. Then, just like before the market vanished, trader packed up their charms. The street hawkers stopped shouting. The healers moved on to other illnesses. The city adjusted. The fear receded. But in your pouch, you still carried one of those pig teeth, just in case. You smell it before you see it. A thick haze of smoke and rosemary clings to the streets. Ash from burning herbs settles in windowsills. Someone's scrawled, "God cleanse us," in charcoal above a doorframe. You step over a pile of spent candles and crunch dried lavender under your boots. London has turned spiritual again. This always happens when no one understands the science. If the sweat can't be studied, it must be summoned. And if it's summoned, then surely it can be banished. So out come the charms, the chants, the stars. In 1494, you watched the city slide fully into superstition like a man slipping into a warm bath labeled nonsense. Astrology books were suddenly impossible to find. They'd been bought, borrowed, or stolen. Everyone wanted to know which stars were in retrograde the day their uncle died drenched in sweat. You remember a merchant refusing to open shop on Wednesdays because Mars is in a foul mood. A noblewoman wouldn't leave her chamber during full moons. One physician even blamed the constellation Leo for heating the air with royal malice, whatever that means. Historians still debate how much influence astrology had on Tudor medicine. The short answer, a lot. Doctors often drew horoscopes before prescribing anything. You might get bled or blistered depending on what Saturn was doing. Odd fact, there were published charts predicting high sweat risk days. People pinned them beside their fireplaces. One even became a drinking song, though everyone who sang it seemed to vanish by autumn. You found work with an apothecary who leaned hard into superstition. She wore red every Thursday, smeared her thresholds with ash, and placed lemons on the windowsill to repel planetary anger. She sold bundles of dried sage, bound with red thread, and for an extra coin, she'd whisper a spell over them. You weren't convinced, but people were surviving. Was it the herbs, the hiding, the luck, or was it something stranger? You lit candles too, not because you believed, but because the dark felt heavier that year. One house near Southwark painted their shutters white and kept a goat in the hallway. Supposedly goats had cool blood. Another household burned a different herb every hour on the hour. You passed them once. Their front room looked like a forest fire in slow motion. It wasn't just astrology. Old pagan customs started reappearing. People whispered about sweat spirits that fed on warmth. A few claimed to hear whispers in the rafters during fevers. One priest even warned his congregation to keep mirrors covered. The sweat, he said, could see itself and grow stronger, and people believed him. You began to notice a pattern. The sicker a household got, the more rituals they added. You saw doorways painted in ash dolls stuffed with salt beds, circled with chalk. Desperation breeds creativity, especially when death is knocking every night. Some started saying the sweat was punishment for pride, for dancing, for learning, for foreign fashion, for lust, gluttony, laziness. Basically, if you enjoyed anything, the sweat was waiting. You helped bury a boy once he died within 4 hours of collapsing in the street. His mother insisted it was because he danced on a Sunday. You didn't argue, you just held the shovel. Churches were overwhelmed. Monks rang bells until their hands blistered. Parishioners walked barefoot through the streets, weeping, praying aloud, offering themselves as sacrifices. Some laid in the road shouting, "Take me instead." Sometimes it worked, sometimes it didn't. You remember a group of flagellants men in white robes whipping themselves bloody while chanting prayers to ward off the sweat. They passed through your street one night, faces hidden, backs striped like meat. You never saw them again. The thing was, the rituals felt like they worked. People needed to believe in cause and effect. You hung rosemary not because it worked, but because the act of hanging it gave you something to do when everyone else was dying. One scholar, before he disappeared, suggested the sweat wasn't just a disease. He called it a moral affliction, a sickness of the soul triggered by collective guilt. It sounded dramatic, but after the third outbreak, you were willing to consider it. Odd detail in some households. People painted protective eyes on the walls, big, staring symbols meant to frighten spirits away. You saw one on a pub door. The pub still burned, but the eyes remained watching the ruins. You weren't immune to it. One night you woke sweating, not from illness, but fear. You'd had a dream, your body dripping with sweat, standing in a circle of fire, while shadowy figures whispered numbers. When you awoke, you counted the rosemary bundles in your room. You added another one just in case. That's how it spread, not just the illness, but the belief in the illness, and the belief that only rituals could save you. When the sweat finally vanished again, the city staggered to its feet like a man waking from a fever dream. The stars no longer mattered. The goat was led outside. Mirrors were uncovered. The lemon on the windowsill went moldy. And you cleaned the soot from your door. You swept the salt into the gutter. You folded the red thread into a drawer just in case. Because deep down, part of you wondered, what if it had worked? You're polishing silver in a quiet hallway when you hear the king is gone. Not dead, gone. Vanished overnight from the royal apartments, like a ghost with a scepter. No fanfare, no announcement, no servants in tow. Just gone. It isn't the first time Henry VIII has disappeared mid-sweat season. It won't be the last. By the time the disease returned in 1507, Henry VIII had long since taken the throne from his father. Young, towering, terrifyingly energetic, he made kingship look like a sport. But when the sweating sickness came knocking, the great athletic king turned into a ghost himself. He worked in one of his lesser palaces, polishing, arranging, staying out of sight, and one morning he simply wasn't there anymore. The guards didn't explain. The ladies in waiting just looked pale. Someone muttered, "The king's taken the west corridor," and that was that. Henry had sweat escape plans, literal architectural blueprints, secret tunnels beneath palaces, staircases hidden behind tapestries, country estates he could flee to in a day's ride. He wasn't ruling England. He was running from it. Historians still debate how many times Henry truly fled in a panic, and how many were just protective retreats orchestrated by his advisors. But the fear that was real. The court would tremble at the first sign of a rash or flushed cheek. If someone so much as looked uncomfortable, their whole wing was cleared. You remember it vividly. The smell of rushes being replaced on the floor, lavender, thrown everywhere, like confetti candles burning through the day in already hot chambers. When the king left, everything stopped. He was terrified of illness in general, any illness but the sweat that was his worst nightmare. You heard stories once. A single servant sneezed near him, and Henry had the man quarantined in a shed and burned his cloak. That could have been a rumor, but honestly, you believed it. Odd fact, Henry VIII changed bedrooms constantly. He rarely slept in the same chamber more than a night or two. He was convinced stale air bred death. Some courtiers joked he ruled with one hand and fled with the other. You weren't laughing. The palace during a sweat scare was eerie. Loud one day, silent the next. Trays of food left outside doors. Letters passed beneath thresholds. Physicians wandered around like plague monks, their noses stuffed with clove and their eyes permanently wide. Henry had good reason to be afraid. The 1507 outbreak hit hard, especially in royal circles. Young nobles died mid-song. Entire household staffs vanished in weeks. It felt selective, like the disease wanted an invitation to court. You saw things. A page boy who suddenly collapsed mid-joke. A lady who danced at supper, then couldn't sit up by midnight. The sweat didn't wait. It didn't warn. It just happened. At one point, you helped carry a chest of linens out to be burned. Inside, you saw what looked like blood, but it wasn't. It was sweat stained black and coppery from fever. The stench was unforgettable. To protect himself, the king started rotating his residences obsessively. Hampton Court, Greenwich, Windsor. He once stayed in a tent for 5 days in a field near Oxford, believing the open air would save him. He ordered the grass flattened around his sleeping area, fearing insects carried death. He was right to worry. Some of his closest companions didn't survive that summer. Historians still debate whether Henry's panic helped or hurt. His constant movement may have spread the disease, or maybe it simply allowed him to outrun it. In any case, he lived, and that meant the country lived with him. Oddly, while his political enemies often suffered outbreaks in their estates, Henry's personal quarters remained strangely untouched. Coincidence? Paranoia may be divine favor. One court poet even wrote that the king is a sun too hot for the sweat to grasp. Sure, okay. You met a healer, around then a young woman, who sold soap made with rosemary and sheep's fat. She claimed it warded off illness. You bought a bar. You still have it wrapped in wax cloth never used, because even though the outbreak passed again, it didn't feel gone. When Henry returned to court, things were quieter. The banquets shorter, the laughter a little thinner. You noticed more charms hung in the halls. Even the king kept a token in his sleeve, a silver medallion stamped with a saint you didn't recognize. Everyone had something by then, a habit, a prayer, a smell. The sweat wasn't just an illness anymore, it was a presence. It had altered the architecture of power, the patterns of court, even the shape of daily life. You stayed in the palace until winter. Then one morning you packed your things and left. You didn't say goodbye. People didn't do that anymore. They just slipped away like the king had done, with as little noise as possible. And as you rode through the misty fields toward nowhere in particular, you realized something. It was no longer about survival. It was about outpacing fear. You didn't expect the French to care. When England coughs, France usually laughs. But in 1528, something strange happened. Someone across the channel caught the sweat. Just one case at first. Then 3. Then it spread like oil across silk. Until now, the sweating sickness had been a uniquely English nightmare. That was part of its mystique. This killer that seemed to haunt only Henry's kingdom, as if the soil itself was cursed. But the 1528 outbreak challenged that. It dared to step out of its foggy homeland and knock on Europe's door. You were in Calais at the time, still technically English soil, but surrounded by French air and French anxiety. You'd taken work as a translator for a spice merchant, mostly because it meant you could sit near the docks where the breezes felt clean. Then one of the dock hands fell. He was young, strong, and had just unloaded a cart of cloth from London. He collapsed in the sun, drenched, gasping. By nightfall, 2 more were dead. The French panicked. Officials burned the entire shipment, the cart, the cloth, even the dock boards the sick man had touched. That night the bells rang, a sound you hadn't heard since Oxford, a sound you'd hoped never to hear again. Odd fact, the sweating sickness outbreak in Calais was one of the only confirmed instances of the disease outside England. It killed quickly, dozens in days, but just as mysteriously as ever it stopped. No further spread into France. It was as if the disease had stuck a toe across the channel and thought, not my vibe, and went back home. Historians still debate whether it was a true continental outbreak or an isolated cluster brought on by bad meat mold or simple coincidence. But to the people who lived through it, it was very real. You remember the fear in the markets, French merchants refusing English coin, caravans turned away at town gates. One city posted signs, no English travelers, no exceptions. The sweat had become xenophobia in action. Back in England, Henry VIII was in full flight mode again. The court scattered. You heard he installed a private quarantine chamber at Hampton Court, complete with separate ventilation and sealed stone floors. This outbreak hit his inner circle harder than ever before. One of the most chilling stories came from Anne Boleyn's household. Several of her servants fell ill within hours. Anne herself fled to Hever Castle, locked herself away, and refused to see anyone but her maid. Henry Besotted sent constant letters, romantic yes, but tinged with sweat-stained terror. He was miles away. He stayed there. Anne survived. So did Henry. But several members of his council didn't, including William Carey, Anne's brother-in-law. He was young, healthy, connected, and still dead in less than a day. You wondered, as always, how the disease chose its targets. One day, you helped carry bundles of herbs to a doctor in Calais. He'd built what he called a cold room in his home, stone-lined, always shaded, filled with bowls of water and salt. He swore it worked. You stayed for tea. He died that night. People burned their clothes, fled cities, covered their mouths with cloth soaked in brandy. Some claimed the disease couldn't survive salt air, so they slept on the beach. You tried it once. It was quiet, at least. The oddest remedy you heard: standing between two yew trees during a thunderstorm. Someone said it equalized the body's electrical vapors. You didn't try it, but you knew someone who did. He got struck by lightning, survived, claimed it worked. By autumn, the cases vanished. The disease retreated, but its message remained. Now the rest of Europe was watching England more carefully. Every sailor from London was checked twice. Every embassy wiped their floors with vinegar. Every diplomat carried a personal supply of garlic and silver. England, for a moment, felt like a leper kingdom. And you crossed the channel back toward Dover, sitting on the deck, wrapped in 3 coats and breathing shallow. Every gust of sea wind felt holy. You didn't speak to anyone on the boat. When you arrived, the docks were empty. No one met the ship. A boy in a cart passed by slowly and handed you a bundle of herbs without a word. Welcome home. The sweat didn't need to spread far. It only needed to remind everyone that it could. It could cross oceans, it could board ships, and if it wanted to, it could follow you anywhere. Cambridge didn't stand a chance. It was the summer of 1528, and the sweat had returned again, and this time it took aim at England's great minds with surgical cruelty. You were passing through the city on your way north, just meant to stay for 2 nights. That turned into 2 weeks. You saw the whole thing. It began like a ghost whispering through college halls. A student in King's College collapsed in the library. Nothing unusual, people thought. He probably hadn't eaten. These young scholars always half-starved themselves for the sake of Plato. Then 2 fellows at Trinity died on the same day. Then 4 undergraduates at St. John's were buried by moonlight so the others wouldn't panic. By the end of the week, the colleges were silent. You watched the city suffocate. At first, the response was practical. Administrators posted notices. No gatherings, no dining halls, lectures postponed until the air clears. Everyone was to remain in their chambers. Meals delivered no visitors, no unnecessary prayer meetings, because apparently necessary ones were immune to disease. But it didn't help. Within days, the sweat tore through the dormitories. The thing about Cambridge, like Oxford, is that it's built for conversation, for community. The very walls that echo with thought also echo with coughs. The corridors are narrow, the staircases tight. You can't whisper without someone 3 floors down hearing you. and this time it moved fast. Students were seen one day reading aloud in their cloisters, and the next their shoes were found by their door untouched since they collapsed. Odd fact, the 1528 outbreak was so rapid at Cambridge that entire colleges were depopulated within 3 days. Not metaphorically, literally. 3 days. You stayed in a guest house on Trumpington Street, just south of the main campus. You watched the university shut itself down like a clock winding in reverse. Candles unlit, lecterns covered, gowns folded untouched. You remember the silence most of all, a silence full of potential futures burning out. One tutor, you met an old man who had survived the earlier outbreaks, invited you to stay with him in his cellar. He'd lived through the 1485 wave and thought he knew what was coming. He was wrong. He started sweating on the second night. He asked you to write his name on the inside of his psalter and send it home to his sister. You still have that book. By day, 3 carts rolled through the city every hour. No bells this time, too many to ring. The fear had evolved. This was no longer about rituals or superstition. No one was burning sage or muttering about stars. They just ran. Or they didn't, and they waited, and those who waited died. You saw a lecturer in astronomy whispering to the sky. He was the last man left in his building, surrounded by books. He kept turning a globe in circles, faster and faster, as if hoping to spin time backward. He died with his hand on North Africa. Some people survived, as always, by chance or by blood or by sheer stubbornness. One young woman, a scribe for Corpus Christi, stayed hidden in the archives beneath the chapel. She later claimed that the musty parchment purified the air. She emerged 3 days later, shaking but alive. She never stopped copying books after that. Historians still debate why this wave hit the universities so viciously. Was it the shared living conditions? The new blood arriving from different parts of England for summer term, the late spring heat? Or some suggested did the sweat simply prefer minds over muscles? Whatever it was, the effect was devastating. You saw entire syllabi left half-finished on desks, candles still burning beside abandoned pens. One student had written a line of poetry mid-verse, "O time thou art," and that was it, gone. The worst moment came on the 4th day when a group of friars entered King's College to offer prayers and didn't come out. One by one, their coughing echoed down the chapel walls. That evening, the porter sealed the doors. Chalk marks appeared on college gates, a red X for closed, a black X for cursed. You don't know who started that, but it spread. Soon even the townsfolk avoided those buildings. Cambridge, once a jewel of intellect, looked like a ghost town carved from stone. You left as soon as you could. The road out of town was lined with burnt piles of clothing. People discarded anything that might carry the bad air. One man burned his entire wardrobe. He walked away in a woolen sheet, barefoot, muttering prayers in Latin and coughing anyway. You didn't look back. Odd detail, one of the only college gardens to survive untouched was that of Emmanuel Hall. No one knows why. Some say the gardener used rosemary water on the paths. Others say it was luck. Today they still grow rosemary there. The summer sun eventually came down hard and long. By mid-July, the sweat relented. Whether it was heat wind or simply its own mysterious rhythm, no one knows. Cambridge reopened in autumn. New students arrived blissfully unaware. Professors resumed lectures. The smell of ink returned to the air. But something had shifted. The libraries felt heavier. The halls echoed with absences. You never returned, because once you hear ideas die mid-sentence, it's hard to listen to learning the same way again. Your grandmother won't open the window. She sits by the hearth with her shawl tight, muttering that the air's not right today. You let it in through the cracks she warns, pointing at the gaps in the old stone wall. That's how it finds you. That's how the sweat finds you. It's been years since the last outbreak, but no one's really let go of it. The country may be breathing again, but it's a shallow breath. The fear lingers like damp on the floorboards, especially among the common folk, those who couldn't run, couldn't afford sage bundles or silver medallions, who had to survive by ritual luck or sheer grit. You're staying in her cottage for the harvest. It's tucked in a wooded pocket of the Midlands, surrounded by hedgerows, and the kind of silence only broken by crows and coughs. And you start to notice the signs. Salt lines under the windows. A broom always facing west. A mirror draped in black cloth. Your grandmother doesn't talk about it directly, but everything she does is part of the defense. A lifetime of learned behavior, passed down, repeated, never questioned. Because in her world, the sweating sickness never truly ended. Odd fact, many rural communities never trusted official explanations for the sweat. They didn't care what the king's physicians said or what the learned men debated in Cambridge. They had their own stories, like the one about the shadow man. He comes with the heat, they say. No face, just a silhouette in the field watching. If you see him, you start sweating within the hour. One village tells of a whole family who died after spotting a dark figure at the edge of the woods. The field has grown wild ever since. You're skeptical, but also you haven't been able to sleep properly since someone mentioned it. Then there's the cursed wind. Warm, too warm and unnaturally still. You feel it pass your skin like breath. The old women say it's the wind that followed soldiers home after Bosworth. Some say it's Henry Tudor's ghostly tax. They're not joking. You overhear children whispering about how to avoid it. Don't walk on newly turned soil. Don't light candles during a full moon. Don't eat root vegetables on Thursdays. You ask one girl why Thursdays. She just shrugs. That's when my uncle died. Fair enough. Your grandmother tells you stories too, softly, while peeling apples. She remembers when a neighbor painted his entire house with whitewash every spring, believing it purified the walls. He died during the 1517 wave. His house still peels in the rain. No one will live in it. Another neighbor buried her first husband with sprigs of mint in his mouth. Said he'd never rot that way. When they opened the grave to bury her second husband, the first was gone. Gone. No body. Just sweat-stained clothes and a trail of salt out the back of the coffin. You try to laugh, but it sticks in your throat. These stories aren't written in any of the royal records. You won't find them in the physicians' books or the university libraries. But they're everywhere, in the way your grandmother refuses to look in the mirror at night, or how every door in the cottage has a nail driven just below the handle to keep spirits from grabbing. Historians still debate whether this kind of folklore helped or hurt. Did it encourage caution, or did it breed fear? The truth is, in places like this, the line between fear and faith is thin. You take a walk one evening near the churchyard. It's golden and quiet, windless. You see a man with a bundle of twigs tied with twine. He's laying them in a cross shape along the church fence. You nod, he nods, and no one explains anything. That night you dream of sweating, of walls that breathe, of someone standing just behind you saying nothing. You wake up clammy and check your wrists for pulse. Still alive, still here. The cottage smells of lavender and old wood. Your grandmother is already up brewing something green in a chipped mug. She says the air will turn today. You don't ask what that means. You've started your own little rituals. A stone in your pocket, a phrase you repeat before bed, a mirror you haven't looked into in 3 days. Just in case. Because whether or not the sweating sickness comes back, the fear of it never left. It lives in shadowy stories, in burned herbs, in bowls of salt by the door. It lives in children who won't play past dusk, in old women who sleep in wool, no matter the heat, and in you now. Because once you've lived through even a story of the sweat, you carry it with you, like heat under the skin, waiting. The summer of 1551 was dry, hot, and too quiet. You were older now. Not old, but enough to walk slower and trust your gut more than your eyes. You felt it before anyone spoke it, a tension in the wind, a stiffness in the air. People began coughing again, and every cough was a gunshot in the heart. After nearly 2 decades of quiet, the sweating sickness came back, and this time, it burned. You were in Shrewsbury when it began, just passing through, delivering a letter for a merchant. A plain job, a peaceful town. But within a week, the churchyard was full. The alehouse was shuttered, and the apothecary was giving out final tonics before lunch. The sweat had returned with a vengeance. Swift, sudden, and like always, impossible to predict. It started in July and lasted just over a month. 1 month. But it tore through towns like fire-licking dry thatch, and this time, everyone knew what it was. There were no debates, no questions. No, is this plague or just a summer fever? No. Everyone remembered, the elders, the middle-aged, even the kids who'd heard the stories around smoky hearths. The moment someone collapsed, soaked and gasping, the name returned the sweat. You didn't even bother trying to leave. Where would you go? By then you'd learned you don't outrun it. You outweighed it. You boarded yourself up in a barn at the edge of town. Took only water, dry bread, a knife, and a bundle of lavender you didn't even believe in anymore. You didn't light a fire. You didn't speak. Odd fact, this final outbreak was incredibly localized. It hit certain towns like Shrewsbury, Oxford, and London, but others barely noticed it. Whole counties went untouched, as if the wind took a different route that year. Historians still debate why. Was it a different strain? Was it dying out naturally, or had the people simply changed how they lived? Cleaner, less crowded, less willing to pretend air was harmless. Shrewsbury, though, it suffered. You'd step outside at dawn and count how many dogs wandered alone. That was your death toll. More dogs equals fewer owners. One night, someone set fire to the chapel, believing the building was cursed. The flames lit the sky, but the sweat didn't leave. The next morning, the man who lit the torch was dead in his bed. You saw neighbors burying family by torchlight. No service, no priest, just quiet and dirt. And then just as suddenly as it came, it stopped. Late August brought cool breezes. The sweating deaths ceased. No gradual taper. Just done. As if it had decided its contract was fulfilled. The town emerged pale hungry, blinking like people woken too early. You walked through the streets and saw windows flung open, piles of burned linens and chalk messages on every door still living, Lord preserve us, gone to hills. You passed a woman who had sat through the outbreak alone, with her baby surviving on rainwater and dried peas. She said nothing, just nodded like you were old war comrades. In London, records show nearly 1,000 deaths in days. But again, the disease vanished without a trace. No after effect, no lingering cases, just mass trauma. You returned to your home, what was left of it, and started putting things back together. That was the final great wave. After 1551, the sweating sickness vanished. Historians call it the mysterious Tudor disease. Medical texts debated it for centuries. Some argued it mutated into something else. Others believed it died out entirely. A few even suggested it wasn't a disease at all, but a reaction, a human response to something environmental, something emotional. That final outbreak felt like a closing curtain. It didn't roar, it hissed, a fast final burn of something that had haunted England for nearly 70 years. You sometimes wondered if people forgot too quickly, if they understood what it meant to live under a threat that didn't follow rules. No vector, no pattern, just presence. The sweat didn't leave behind a vaccine or a grave of patient zero. It left behind behavior. People washed more, avoided crowds, respected seasons, and they passed down the knowledge, not through books, but habits. Even today, you catch yourself pausing at the sound of a cough. Even now, some folks keep lavender by the window in July, just in case, because even if it never comes back, it could, and that's enough. And now it's gone, vanished like a ghost at sunrise, leaving behind no grave, no final host, no name to etch in a tombstone. You lived through it. You walked beside it. You waited for it. You feared it. And now you're left with silence. By the time the year turned to 1552, the sweat had disappeared so thoroughly it was almost as if it had never existed. No cases, no whispers, no sweating, shrieking neighbors, no bells tolling across fog-heavy fields, just the soft, hesitant return of life. You weren't sure whether to trust it. You moved slower, talked less, you drank your water warm, and stood away from crowds even when the market was full of color again. You'd spent too many nights half-breathing, wondering whether you'd wake up soaked, wondering if that ache in your joints was a draft or the beginning of your last chapter. And you weren't alone in that. The country didn't hold parades. There were no declarations of victory, just a quiet, exhausted acceptance. Everyone walked like they were still dodging something. Odd fact, there has never been a confirmed case of sweating sickness since that final wave in 1551. Historians still scratch their heads, digging through letters, diaries, royal records. They search for a new name. It might have taken some believe it evolved into another disease, maybe influenza, maybe typhus. Others think it was a freak pathogen that simply burned itself out, but the most haunting theory that it still exists, dormant, watching, waiting for the right climate, the right crowd, the right window left open on a warm night. You think about that sometimes, especially in late summer when the breeze feels off and the air goes still in the evening. You still sleep with a cloth under your pillow soaked in lavender. Habit. You still walk the long way around the apothecary's stall. You still carry a pebble in your pocket. Nothing special, just one. You picked up from the chapel steps the morning after the outbreak ended. A reminder, because the strangest thing is not that it vanished, it's that no one truly believed it would. You talk to people sometimes, survivors like you. They still wear herbs around their necks. They still watch the skies. One woman tells you she won't eat garlic unless she's had a bad dream. The smell keeps the sweat spirits away. Another says she drinks vinegar every Tuesday because her cousin didn't. The sweat may be gone, but the memory of its sour, sticky quiet is stitched into the soul of the country in wooden prayer beads, in shuttered windows, in little chalk marks by cottage doors that no one has the heart to scrub off. You begin writing things down, everything you remember, the names, the sounds, the shapes. You draw the heat lines in the air with your finger before you go to bed, just like your grandmother used to. Not out of fear, not anymore, but because forgetting would be worse than dying. Because forgetting invites it back. Historians will debate forever what sweating sickness really was. A virus, a poison, a collective nightmare. But you know, it was an invisible storm that walked like a man. It wore your friend's face. It slipped in through cracks. It whispered to your sweat glands and stole your heartbeat. And it left you behind not because you were strong, but because it hadn't finished yet. So you live slowly, softly. You speak gently, light your candles with care, and listen to the weather, to the breath of the house, to the space between seconds. You survived. And then every summer, when the air starts to hum and the windows open, you place your palm on the wood frame just for a moment, and you whisper, "Not today." You've reached the end. You made it. The sweat came like a nightmare again and again, burning through centuries, slicing through cities, unraveling bodies in hours. It wasn't polite or logical or even consistent. It was a mystery wrapped in panic, stitched into generations by whispers and fever. But now, it's quiet. So let's slow everything down. The bells have stopped ringing. The shutters are open. The air is cool on your skin, and the candlelight flickers gently across the wall. The rush of history fades into the soft hush of knowing you are here and the danger has passed. For now, you've traveled through 60 years of fear ritual, royal panic countryside, superstition, and desperate hope. You've walked with kings who ran faster than their guards. You've stood beside scholars who watched brilliance dissolve into sweat. You've listened to old women chant protections into their porridge and watched children draw circles in ash because that's what kept Grandma alive. And now you breathe easier because sometimes surviving doesn't look like triumph. It looks like washing your hands without thinking. It looks like sleeping through a hot night and waking up anyway. It looks like passing stories down, not to scare, but to prepare. You lived, and as the fire crackles and the night deepens, you can rest. The world is still, and so are you. You are safe. You are remembered. You are here. Good night.